Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the managing partner of Scott Legal. And today we are going to talk about E-2 visas, and we're going to go through exactly what the E-2 visa requirements are, in particular for cases that are where the investment amount is low or they are risky cases. So that's something that Scott Legal does a lot of. And also, just so that you know, I'm in the US on an E-2 visa. So applied for an E-2 visa around 12 years ago, and we've been through 2 renewals so far. We're definitely an E-2 success story. We have over 13 full-time employees. So definitely know what you are going through. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel. And so we do encourage you to go to the YouTube channel and hit the subscribe button as we do regular webinars. We do webinars, at least one webinar every week, and sometimes 2 webinars. And so a lot of interesting and relevant information there. After the webinar, we'll send you that recording. We'll also send you the PowerPoint presentation that we will go through today. And we will also send you some more information, send you a link where you can set up a consultation. And we'll also send you a guide, an E-2 visa guide that has a lot of the information that we are going to go through today. In terms of if you do have questions during the presentation, please feel free to add the questions to the Q&A box. Some people sent in questions earlier, so we will address those as well. And the Q&A or the chat function, we will get to all questions and have plenty of time for that. So without further ado, let us jump right into the presentation. So the E-2 visa is a visa that is really based on investing money in the United States. So it's maybe either you're going to start a business in the United States or you're going to purchase a business in the United States. And one of the core elements of this program, though, is that there has to be a treaty between the US and the country that the person is coming from. Now, when we talk about the country the person's coming from, the passport is what's going to be relevant. So it's not the country of birth. When we look at green cards, sometimes green cards are going to be based on where the person was born. But here we're looking at passports. So if a person has multiple passports, they can pick and choose which one, as long as they have the relevant passport for the treaty country. And there are around 80 or so treaty countries, and countries are added to the list, and sometimes they're removed from the list. Recently, Israel was added to the list. New Zealand was added to the list. Portugal was recently added to the list. Ecuador has been removed from the list, and a few other countries have been removed over the years. So you do have to make sure you're working with the latest list of E-2 visa countries to make sure that you are eligible. So when we look at the E-2 visa, the E-2 visa is going to require that you have a entity within the United States, and the entity within the United States you're going to have to a national from the treaty country is going to have to own that entity, have at least 50% ownership in that entity. So that's going to be kind of a core requirement that the E-2 visa is going to require, that national of the treaty country owns at least 50% of the entity within the United States. And 50-50 is fine. A lot of the time the question comes up is whether you need more than 50, 51, et cetera, but 50% is sufficient. The next E-2 visa requirement has to do with making an investment. So you do have to invest money in the United States. And this is, this is one that is difficult for some people because they have to make the investment even before they get the visa, right? So a lot of our clients ask, like, well, how can I make the investment? I don't know if I'm going to get the visa. So it is a bit of a situation where you do have to spend the money, risk the money before you invest, because the government is crystal clear that they do not permit. This is not a visa that is granted for the intent, when someone just has the intention to invest. So you can't, for example, just put money in a business bank account and then say, I want to apply for an E-2 visa, because the government says that money isn't really an investment, because they feel that you could just go into the bank account and take the money out if you wanted to. So that really is trying to get at what the slide means by at risk. So when you invest money, it has to be either spent or committed. So that's, the government wants to see that it's an at-risk investment. So money sitting in an idle bank account is not going to be sufficient. So you're also required to do something where you show that where the money came from. So show that the money is coming from a legitimate source. And so I will have to show the government. So for example, if the money's coming from savings, then you would show the government that you have their tax returns to show that you were able to accumulate funds over time. If the money came from selling a property, you would show documentation related to selling that property, et cetera. So that is a requirement for E-2 visa as well. The investment has to be substantial. The regulations don't say exactly what substantial means. For some visas, like the EB-5 visa, for example, the regulations are clear that the amount has to be 800,000 or 1,050,000. But for the E-2 visa, they just say substantial. So that's going to be substantial in relation to the business itself. And we are going to talk about that in subsequent slides, so we won't focus much on that here. The types of expenditures, they're lease, office supplies, equipment, marketing, money that you spend on your website. Those are all good E-2 visa expenditures. Employees, if you have employees already and you spend money on that, that's what I'd say is a good E-2 visa expenditure. Some expenditures are not so great, like if you, for example, the expenditure you use to travel to the United States or food that you purchase while here, things like that. Those are not great. And as I said earlier, you can invest in a business or you can purchase a business. Sometimes when people purchase a business, they do something called, they utilize what's called an escrow account. And the escrow account is something where you, instead of giving the money directly to the seller, you put the money in escrow, and then you have a condition that says that the E-2 visa is dependent, the E-2 visa is contingent rather on the approval of the transfer of the funds rather is contingent on the approval of the E-2 visa. So that way, the escrow agent who's holding the money will only give the money to the seller if the E-2 visa is approved. And if it's not approved, then they'll give the money back to the buyer. So that allows you to avoid having to get the money back from the seller in case the E-2 visa actually isn't approved. So there is some protection that can be given for in some instances where you're purchasing a business, so purchasing a restaurant or purchasing a convenience store, a gas station, or whatever type of business that you're purchasing. The other big E-2 visa requirement is that the business has to hire U.S. workers. So the way that this is described in the regulations is the business cannot be marginal. However, what that really means is that you have to hire U.S. workers. And when you're hiring U.S. workers, you want to make sure that you are hiring workers that are not just friends and family, but actual legitimate U.S. jobs. And it can be anyone. It can be U.S. citizens, green card holders, or others. Definitely U.S. citizens and green card holders are better from the perspective of the form that we fill out that shows who has been hired. That does differentiate between U.S. citizens, green card holders, and people on work visas, right? So the other thing is the business does have to be real and operating. So it can be at the point of ready to be operational. So that's what you really want in terms of the business at the point of being operational. So we had one client that went for her interview some time ago, and she was opening up a gym. And when she went to her interview, the examiner asked her, so if I went into the business right now, what would I see? And she said, well, the equipment's there. We've already gotten the lease. The employees are hired. And the only thing that we're waiting for is the visa for me to start to open the doors. And that's the kind of thing that the examiner would want to hear. So all of the things you see listed on this slide, like, you have your website, you have maybe contracts in place, you have licenses, really everything needed to get the business up and running. And the other requirement is that you have the intent to return to your home country after the E-2 visa has been approved. The development direct, that's usually covered by just owning 50% of the company. But I think it is important to say that the E-2 visa is not a visa that is available for a passive investor, right? So someone who just wants to come to the United States and invest and just take a profit or a dividend or interest. It's not available for passive investors. You do have to be kind of an active participant in the business. So that does kind of fall under the development direct as well. So a little bit more about the regions or the countries that where E-2 visa is applicable. They really are across all continents except Antarctica. There are E-2 visa countries, a lot of them in Europe. There are E-2 visas in Africa, Asia, Latin America, South America, and the Middle East. So, really E-2 visa countries all over. And we talked about already that this is something that's going to be available for people who want to purchase a business or start a business from scratch. If you purchase a business, you instead of doing a business plan, you're really going to show that the business has employees already. So you're going to show tax return information and W-2 information showing that the business has employees already. And whereas if you start a business, you're going to show a business plan that shows that you are going to be able to hire employees over time. And then when we have that, we like to include other pieces of evidence to kind of bolster that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. In terms of the validity, so how long is an E-2 visa issued for? So it really depends on a few things. So one is going to be the country you're from. So the country you're from will determine whether or not the visa is issued for 3 months or 5 years in terms of the absolute time that it can be issued. So a national from Canada, UK, Germany, several other countries, the visa can be issued for a maximum of 5 years. But then other countries, like for example, Bangladesh and Egypt, the visa can only be issued for 3 months. And when we think of the visa, the E-2 visa, like any visa, you should always think of a visa as an entry document only, right? So even when a visa is issued for 3 months, it doesn't mean the person can only stay in the US for 3 months. It means they have 3 months to enter the United States. And then once they're in the United States, they are granted 2 years in E-2 visa status, so they can live and work in the United States for that 2 years. But then if they subsequently left the United States, they would need a new visa to re-enter. And again, thinking of it as an entry document. Now, even though a visa can be issued for up to 5 years, sometimes when you go to a consulate, the consular officer might say that, well, your business is okay, but I'm not sure that you're going to be able to hire the employees that you say you're going to be you're going to be able to hire. So we're going to issue the visa for 2 years instead of 5 years. And then we want you to come back after 2 years and show us that you are actually able to hire US workers, right? So that's sometimes even though the visa validity period is much longer, in some instances you will get issued the visa for a shorter period of time because the government thinks that they like to see more with respect to your ability to create US jobs. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is probably the number one question that we have with E-2 visas, and that is how much investment is enough, right? So because the statute doesn't indicate the exact investment amount, we have to sometimes look at different factors to determine whether or not the investment that a person wants to make is sufficient. So one of the things the government looks at is the type of business, right? So they look at what will it cost to set up a particular type of business, and if the business is a service-oriented business, then certainly that's going to cost less than if the business was, for example, a car manufacturing plant. Now, despite the fact that a service-oriented business, we could argue that it only costs $5,000 or less to get started or to get operational, the government is still going to require that you spend a lot more than that. So we recommend often spending at least $50,000, even for a service-oriented business. And that's sometimes the challenge with those, because not many E-2 visas get approved with very low investment amounts, like 20,000 or 25,000. Those are very, very low investment amounts. Even 50,000 is a very low investment amount. If you are on the lower side, like under $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, would on the lower side, you would be really expected to invest the full amount of the full amount. So if you have an investment of you're buying a restaurant or something like that, and you spend 300 or 400,000, you really would be expected to invest the full amount. Versus if you were buying a business for $10 million, then you may be able to invest a couple $1 million or much lower, and that still might qualify for the substantial. The key here is that there is no minimum set dollar amount that is required. Each case is going to be different. And the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that the amount that's required might also depend on not just on the business, but might also depend on the actual business itself, right? Because the merits of the particular business itself, because the business, the type of business could impact in the sense of, we've done doctors' offices where the investment amount's very low, but then the examiner may see that every doctor office that they've been to, or think that every doctor's office that they've been to has a bunch of employees. So see that it's going to be easy, think that it's going to be easy to hire US workers. So that might give the case a boost. But then also the case just could have other factors that make the case strong. It could be that there are already US workers that are working at the company. It could be that the person has lots of letters of intent to bolster that they actually do have lots of prospects. So all of those things are going to be considered, and it is important to work very closely with your immigration attorneys to kind of figure out what a reasonable investment amount is. So now kind of getting into the crux of some of the nuances or issues with respect to riskier cases or low investment amounts, and some of the strategies that you can do to deal with lower investment amounts. So one factor, one strategy is really bolstering the other parts of the case that are very positive. So it could be that, for example, the person has particular experience. I know when I did my E-2, they liked the fact that I had a bunch of business experience and that I went to Harvard Law School and things like that. They liked all of that. So bolstering those, any positive aspect that you can, that can be important. If you have employees already, then putting those front and center in your application. When we do E-2 visa cover letters, we have a section right at the top, which is a summary. And the summary is not a general summary. The summary is a summary that bolsters all of the key parts of the case, right? So the important parts of the case that are very positive in the case, and we, to put those front and center. We talked earlier about contracts and letters of intent, or things that show that the business has lots of prospects. Those should be front and center as well. And sometimes if those are front and center, then we don't have to have as much of an investment amount. If the government sees, like there's one doctor's office that we did where the client had a number of insurance contracts. They were treating a particular disorder, and they had a number of insurance contracts. It was crystal clear that the business was going to be very, very successful and would require hiring a number of employees very quickly just based on those contracts. And so with that, you really could, you could get away with a much lower investment amount, as we did in that case. I think that case, the investment amount was around $20,000 or $25,000. Another thing that you could get is a letter from the Chamber of Commerce. So whenever we say this to a client, the clients go to the Chamber of Commerce and they say, oh, it's difficult to get, they don't want to do it. But then, they talk to the Chamber of Commerce a bit more, and then they write a beautiful letter, a letter that says that they believe that the business would impact the local community and create jobs and things like that. So those can be very, very helpful for an E-2 visa file, especially if the investment amount is low. The other thing that can help is if the business is already operational and generating revenue, really highlighting that. So that's another aspect. For a new business, you're always going to need a business plan, right? And the business plan should be a strong business plan that talks about all of the key elements. A credible business plan that has a personnel chart, 5 years of financial projections. But really, it's all the time, and especially the executive summary is going to give the examiner a really good overview of your case. And if the examiner sees the case and the examiner kind of looks at it and says, hey, yeah, I could really see this business doing well, that can be really helpful for your case, because really that's what they're trying to assess with the investment amount. They're trying to assess, will this investment amount allow the individual to create US jobs? And if you've hired employees already, again, that's going to be very, very, very important or very, very useful for your application. And to the extent that you can do that, you can hire employees before you actually apply. That's going to be very useful. And that in itself can reduce the investment amount that's required. The other thing that you can consider, and we don't necessarily want to go in with this first. I think that sometimes if the consulate denies or they have issues, we will do this on a second attempt, is a CPA letter that says, hey, like we've looked at the business plan, we've looked at the expenditures, and this person has spent everything that they need to spend for this particular type of business, and that can be helpful. As well. So let's look at a few types of common expenditures, both kind of good and bad we'll talk about. So everything listed here is good, we'll say. The only one that's maybe not so great is legal fees. So we always include legal fees in our investment amount, but they are, I say, they're not as good as the other things that are on this list. In particular, payroll is amazing. Furniture, inventory, equipment, computer equipment, and others, websites, that's all great. For a lease, you can only include what you've actually paid. So if you've prepaid the lease for a year, then you can include that. If you've only paid first and last month's rent and security, then that's all you can include. So things to. Okay, so there's some more listed here, and I think that when we look at these, we look at another one I just want to point out is car, truck, and really I think that we only want to utilize that if the car and truck is really needed for the business. The other kind of expenditure that I think is not as great is training courses, because that's kind of equivalent to going to school, right? Like when I did my when I did my law degree, I couldn't include 3 years of law school in my investment expenditure schedule. So, and then here are some examples of some relatively weak E-2 visa expenditures. So, travel, flights. And sometimes what's interesting about this is sometimes sometimes the websites of various consulates will actually say that they think that these expenditures are not very good. So that's something that if a few of them are actually putting on their website that they feel that these expenditures are not very good, then that is a good indication that perhaps we want to not include these, even though a particular consulate may not explicitly indicate these on their websites. They're not good, and a lot of the time, the consulate might feel that you're stretching and that you don't have actual legitimate E-2 visa expenditures, and that could be harmful for your case. So some more, tips and challenges for consulting businesses. And again, we do a lot of consulting businesses, service-oriented businesses. The law firm was founded on a service business, and they can be a challenge. Because sometimes consulates in different jurisdictions in particular don't like service-oriented businesses. They feel that the E-2 is better for bricks and mortar type businesses like restaurants, etc. So sometimes they can be a challenge. But as I said, some of the things that you can do is the CPA letter can be helpful to show that you've spent enough, highlighting that the business is already doing well if it's already operational. Kind of spending more. Like I think one of the things that is helpful in these applications is actually spending more money. Because if you do have a higher investment amount, the higher the investment amount, the more because it's an objective thing, the more that the government is going to feel that, yeah, they are, it's better for the individual. So the another higher risk area is equity trading companies. So equity trading companies are high risk because the government sees them as somewhat passive. So with equity trading, the passive nature of the trading activities, like for example, let's say someone is sitting in their home jurisdiction and their home rather, and they're day trading or trading for friends or family members, things like that. The government may think that that is passive and not really an actual business. So that's something that you always have to keep your eyes open for. And when that's done, we really want to make sure that we're focusing on the business, that making sure that the business is one that could actually hire US workers. So that's something I think that is always going to be a focus. And the other kind of thing to think of when you're looking at equity trading companies is they are highly regulated industry, so you want to make sure that the you do have the proper licenses, et cetera. So we've done E-2 visas for equity trading companies where the visas are a lot of the investment expenditure amount relates to legal fees. So because they're paying business lawyers a lot of money to set up the structure and get everything organized. But we've been successful with them, and I think that the ones that aren't successful are the ones that don't work, where people are trading for friends and family, et cetera. You want to make sure that there actually is enough activity for enough activity. So one thing I see, the slide that's missing from here is a real estate. So another kind of high risk area that we see is real estate investments. And this can be real estate in a number of different areas, but the one good example is the situation where someone buys a particular property and then says that they're going to renovate it, flip it, and then wants an E-2 visa. That's going to be very problematic for a few reasons. So one is the government is going to say that that particular business is passive, right? So the person doesn't need a visa because it's not really work, and it's not going to be something that's where they're going to be able to hire U.S. workers. Similarly, if someone buys a particular building or buys a house and then rents it out. Now, we have done successful kind of property management businesses, but in those instances, the person has owned many, many properties. So maybe owned over 50 properties. And so that necessitated hiring many people. And then, you can make an argument that that actually is a real business. So I think that one of the things with real estate businesses is that the government inherently looks at them as passive, so you have to kind of overcome that. But we have successfully done a number of real estate businesses, including real estate brokerages, property management businesses. Sometimes home renovation businesses work really well. Sometimes people come and say, oh, I want to do house flipping, but we say, well, in order to do that, you probably have to have 20, 30 houses. And so your investment amount is going to go up significantly, but maybe it can be positioned as a home flipping business. And then we can add in the business plan that you plan to do home flipping as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So now let's look at just generally like E-2 visa denials and kind of why visas are denied, and some reasons that E-2 visas are denied. So one reason is low investment amount. So we talked about that in terms of what the proportionality test and the type of business, but that is a reason that sometimes E-2 visas are denied. But that is a particularly good reason, because if that is the reason, then we can just invest more, right? The person can invest more provided they have more. Sometimes it's the nature of the business, and that this kind of goes back to the equity trading businesses and the real estate businesses. Those can be problematic. Those can be problematic in the sense that the government thinks that they're passive. Sometimes it's just a matter of where the person is filing. So sometimes just the filing venue. So the location is, if the filing venue is somewhere that the consulate in that particular region can just be very difficult, right? So there are a number of those where the filing venue is very, very difficult. So that's something. So sometimes people have the choice of venue. So we'll always advise clients with respect to where they apply if they actually do have the choice. Another reason petitions are denied, and this one actually is a really tough one to overcome, is that if the government feels that the business will not hire U.S. workers. So sometimes we've had situations where the person has had a business in their home country, and the business in their home country hasn't hired U.S. workers. And then they say, well, why do you think that it's going to be different if you come to the United States? And so that can be problematic. The other is issues with the adjudicating officer. Sometimes officers are just unfortunately very difficult, and no matter what you do or say, it's not going to satisfy them. So that's sometimes difficult. And then sometimes it's just the person didn't meet the requirements. So sometimes, we've had people that have applied on their own. They've put $100,000 in a business bank account and then applied for an E-2 visa. And in that case, you don't meet the requirement because your funds are not at risk. So in terms of adjudication trends, approval rates, we see government approval rates over the years between 80, 90%. Scott legal approval rates around 98%. Past results don't predict future outcome, but definitely any way you look at it, the approval rates are high. London processing times, they're taking a while still, like probably between 60 to 80 days, just business days to review the application. Toronto, once you submit the application, you can usually get an appointment within a month or so, 6 weeks. And then generally you have to check, like the consular processing times are really going to depend on the actual consulate. So that's going to really depend. The USCIS versus consulate, now, generally speaking, we always encourage people to apply at a consulate. And the reason that we do that is because you actually get the visa, so you're able to come in and out. If you apply through USCIS, you're only extending or changing your status. You can do that if you're in the United States and you can enter on ESTA. You're only applying or to change your status or extend your status. And when the first time you leave the US, you have to actually go back to the consulate and apply for the visa from scratch. So that can be, it's going to be more expensive, that's for sure, because you have to pay a lawyer for two visa applications. But also, I think that if you, given you have to go back to the consulate anyway, I think that it's it's probably worth just doing that in the first instance. Some other areas that to keep in mind, and some of the questions that come up, whether or not you have to hire employees before you apply, and you don't. I mean, definitely the visa is it's going to be a stronger case if you do hire employees before, but it's not a requirement. The source of funds, in particular, if you do a USCIS filing, the source of funds is going to be extremely complex because they want a very, very detailed accounting. So that's going to be very different from a consulate. If it's a consulate, we're probably going to include, 1 or 2 pages. Gifts and loans are fine for E2, but you do have to show where the source is. And we talked about the E2 investor ownership. It could be 50-50. Often the question comes up whether it has to be 51%. And then the other interesting thing is if you change of ownership, or you have to keep the ownership at least 50%. But if you just change the business, let's say you do a consulting business and then you decide, oh, I don't want to do consulting anymore. I want to do open up a restaurant. And then, you can't just do that, right? You can't just say, okay, well, it's the same legal entity and I'm just going to do that. You have to apply for some type of permission. So that's something. And then the only other thing to keep in mind is when you're doing the E-2 visa and you're buying things from family, whether it's buying equipment from them, buying the actual business from them, et cetera, those transactions can be quite suspect and can generate a number of different questions from an officer. So that's something to keep in mind. Excellent. So those are all the prepared remarks that we have today, and there were a number of questions. So I'm going to just read them one by one, and then start to answer them. So the first one is, I'm a Jordanian citizen living in Dubai. I do have property in Jordan. What is the minimum amount of a business to grant an E-2 visa? So I think I don't know if you joined late, but much of the presentation was where we talked about minimum investment amounts and how there is no actual minimum. The money doesn't have to come from Jordan. So that's there is no requirement in E2 that the money comes from the treaty country. It's just that the person has to be a treaty country member. And you can, if you're living in Dubai, you can actually apply in Dubai, even though you're not a UAE citizen. Okay, if I'm a Canadian citizen, if I'm partnering with existing business owner, do the existing business owners required to share the tax returns for the last 3 years? So not if they're not applying for the E2. So if you're applying for an E2, this is different from EB5, but for E2, if you're applying for an E2, then you just have to show where you got your money from. That's all that's required. Next question, is a loan from my country considered a legitimate source of funds? So yes, it is. After a business is operated, how long will it take for the visa to be issued? So it depends on the consulate, but if you go to a consular interview, normally it's about 5 days that it takes them to issue the visa into your passport. I'm planning to partner in the existing business worth 950,000. As I have 50% partner, do I need to invest 475,000 or less amount may qualify? I think 300,000 or 300,000 could work, but I would invest the 475,000 to make sure that you don't have any issues. And then someone had sent in a question related to gold. I'm blanking on the question. I think the question was if they, oh yes, if they inherited $30,000 worth of gold, can that be used as a source of funds? Well, it could, but the government may ask where the person who, the person who gave you the money or who you inherited it from got the money from. So that's it's going to be the same source of funds analysis. Just because it's gold, think of it as cash, and then showing where the gold or where the cash came from. Another question that came in, can we get a loan with real estate business? You can, but it would just, the only loans that aren't good for E2 are where the security is the business. So if your real estate business means that you have property and then there are loans against that property, that could be a problem because the security usually will be the assets of the business. So that often could be a problem. Perfect. So I think, let me just check to make sure that there are no more questions here, but I don't think that there are. Chat. Okay, yeah, perfect. So I think we've answered all the questions, and glad everyone could attend and participate. As I said, you'll get a lot of information. You'll get the PowerPoint presentation. You'll get the link to the actual webinar, a guide, and a link where you can set up a consultation. Thank you.